Sawadee Krap, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, we are going to be opening the discussion about women and performance enhancing drugs, and specifically we're going to be looking at the application of the compound testosterone. This is potentially a very controversial subject, but it's also, in my opinion, one that is very, very misunderstood by most people in our community. So I'm going to start by explaining the traditional pathways of elevation of anabolic potential in women through PEDs. Most people hopefully would be familiar that there is a number of drugs that are commonly used by women in this domain, and those drugs are basically selected on their skewed androgenic to anabolic ratios. These drugs were developed for clinical practice in deployment in what we would call androgen sensitive cohorts. In other words, individuals who are sensitive to androgens, women, children, and the elderly. And these drugs, therefore, lend themselves to the deployment in women who are interested in using them as PEDs, obviously. Now, part of the challenge is understanding that in none of these drugs have they ever successfully totally separated the androgenic component, right? There is some androgenic component to all of these drugs, right? Every single last one of them. If you expose yourself to enough of them, you have the potential to create a problem in women through basically virilization and a range of side effects that are basically associated with the androgenic impact of these drugs. Setting aside all of the regular problems about HDL cholesterol suppression and that men suffer, women also have a secondary class of problem, which is we need to minimize the androgenic impact on women. So I just want to run through some of these drugs, and I'm going to choose trenbolone to explain this because trenbolone is, in my opinion, probably the most misunderstood in the whole pantheon of drugs that we have in common use. Most people would look at that and go, how the hell can trenbolone be used here? Because it has an androgenic rating greater than testosterone. And this is true. The thing about this, though, is that these drugs are basically compared to each other on a milligram by milligram basis. And what that basically means is when you have an androgenic rating of 185 compared to 100, if you use 1 milligram of nandrolone and 1 milligram of trenbolone and 1 milligram of testosterone, then the androgenic impact of trenbolone would obviously be greater than that of the testosterone. However, if you were to use half of the trenbolone, okay, so a half a cc or a half a mil, then effectively what you've done is you've lowered by small margin the androgenic potential of trenbolone when compared to testosterone. By using less of the drug, we've effectively created a lower androgenic profile. And that, if you understand that, is part of the problem with all of these drugs with the deployment against women. In other words, if you use a lot of these drugs, any perceived benefit or advantage or tolerability that's created through having an androgenic anabolic ratio skewing can be lost, right? I'm going to give you a overly simplified example here, but bear with me. The reason I'm going to simplify it is I want the numbers to make sense to people. If you look at males, right? Males produce, on average, about 10 milligrams of testosterone a day. Now, that's not an exact number. The numbers does vary individual to individual. Clearly, this is an average discussion, an averaging discussion. And people argue, it's less than that, it's more than that. Let's just, for the sake of keeping this able to be easily understood, say it's 10 milligrams a day, 70 milligrams a week. Okay. Now, women most certainly produce testosterone. They just make significantly less of it. Right? So women produce somewhere between 10 and 15 times, men produce somewhere between 10 and 15 times more testosterone than women. Okay. So if we make 10 milligrams a day, let's just for the sake of the discussion say women make 1 milligram a day of testosterone. So hopefully you can understand that. We make 70 milligrams a week as a natural man. Women make 7. Okay. Now, this is where the problems start with these other drugs, where you basically say, right, so if I use 5 milligrams of Anavar a day, right, and the androgenic component of Anavar has been reduced when compared to testosterone to 1/5, okay, that's about, guess what, 1 mil a day, okay? So 5 milligrams a day is extremely well tolerated in women. Very, very few women get any sort of androgenic side effects from 1 milligram of Anavar a day. And the reason is that, okay, it's had its androgenic impact reduced by about 5. Women make about 1 milligram of testosterone a day, approximately. And Anavar therefore represents, at 5 milligrams a day, a similar androgenic profile to 1 milligram of testosterone a day. Now we take 10, we've effectively doubled it. We've doubled the androgenic potential of that drug when compared to their natural production of testosterone. And so the moment you cross that threshold, you have the potential. That doesn't mean it's actually going to occur 100% of the time in 100% of individuals, but you have the potential to start to see androgenic impact the moment you cross that threshold. So 10 milligrams a day, some individuals you start to see side effects, 15, 20. The problem isn't the Anavar, right? The problem is the dose, all right? The more you take, the greater the androgenic load you're exposing that woman to. Okay, so when we go back and look at the drugs that are in common use in females, you can see there is absolutely a dose that is going to be well tolerated by most women, but that dose is very small, right? And this is also true for, as I said, drugs like Trenbolone. When Trenbolone was deployed in human clinical use, it was marketed towards androgen-sensitive cohorts, women particularly, okay? But the amount they gave them was such that it was ideally small enough amount to basically at least realize the therapeutic benefits of the medication without too many androgenic side effects. And for Trenbolone, that was a clinical dose of 1 ampule of Trenbolone every 10 days. Okay, and there was 76 milligrams of Trenbolone, a little less than that because you have to withdraw the molecular weight of the long-acting ester that was attached, so it's actually less than that. But it was basically a relatively moderate dose, and they still saw virilization effects and masculinization effects at those dosages. So this leads us to the discussion, well, why then is testosterone off the table? The only reason it's off the table basically is because if you were going to use it as a PED in women, just as they use it in testosterone replacement in women, older women who are basically have been through menopause, most certainly use this compound, you have to basically use very, very small doses of it. If you were to do a replacement dose of testosterone, that would literally be 1 milligram a day. Okay, so it would be a very small amount of testosterone, would be just as tolerable as any of these other drugs. And this is the surprising thing about people. They think that, well, testosterone shouldn't be on the table. But that doesn't make any sense, right? The dose matters, right? Women make testosterone naturally. If they have a certain level of testosterone for natural production, so I'm just going to click through the slide here. So if we go over here and look at what the typical testosterone levels in nanograms per deciliter are for a woman, and we say, well, there's a range just like within men, it's about 1/10 of what men have, maybe even less than that, between 10 and 15 times more circulating testosterone for men. As long as you're within that threshold, you're not really introducing elevated androgenic impact risk. You're replacing what they naturally have. Okay, as I said, the risk comes from all of these drugs when you exceed that threshold. So 5 milligrams of Anavar a day seems to be extremely well tolerated basically by women, but as soon as you move to 10, you start to see problems. Most women use more than that, right? So this opened the discussion, well, is testosterone a valid and viable performance enhancing drug for women? Yes, of course it is. You just have to have a very tightly controlled conversation around quote unquote the dose. So I want to show you a study that was done on this is a 10-week study where healthy young women were administered testosterone, and basically what they looked at was the impact on body composition and on endocrine markers, and they were basically then obviously looking at increases in performance against that dosage of testosterone. Now, what's important to note about this, if I go back, go back one slide. I made this mark in the bottom right hand corner of this page, right, because it's basically pointing out. So the dose that they gave women in this study resulted in a increase in testosterone levels to 123 nanograms per deciliter. That's significantly more than natural women produce, and so therefore you can understand that they have not only crossed the super physiological barrier for women, they are basically starting to see two things. One is performance enhancement outcomes and androgenic impact. Okay, you cross that line, that's what you basically see. Now, the obvious question was, in this particular study, how did they elevate testosterone? So basically they had a placebo control group and they had another group of women where they were administering testosterone as a cream, and they were giving them 10 milligrams a day, which is, a surprisingly large amount in my opinion. But that resulted in a certain elevation of testosterone levels beyond natural range that, as I said, produced an increase in performance outcomes and an increase in what we would refer to as adverse events for women. Not health-related adverse events, really. When we look down these the endocrine values and the health marker values, they weren't out of control, but we started to see virilization outcomes. So this leads us then to can we use testosterone as a performance-enhancing drug in women? Potentially, yes, but it's very tricky, and I want to explain why it's very tricky. When you're dealing with very small doses of something like a milligram or 2 milligrams, and the format that these drugs are typically supplied in are really geared towards men. They really are, right? You end up with this complexity of, well, so how do I deliver 10 milligrams a week? Okay, so if I decide that natural range is 7 milligrams a week, and I'm going to basically start at 7 milligrams a week and slowly titrate up and watch for side effects. How do you do that? How do you deliver 1 milligram or 1 and a little bit milligrams a day? It becomes complicated to do that with any degree of accuracy and certainty. And so I just wanted to show you a couple of things here that if you are a woman, and I'm going to come back to this thing, if you are a woman, that I think you need to pay attention to. So the first one is this. I believe that for women, the idea of weekly dosing is a very bad idea. I don't really even support this for men, but realistically with men, it's about side effect mitigation. But with women, the side effect that we're mitigating really is like potentially significantly worse here. So microdosing. If you're going to take so many milligrams a week, don't take it once a week. Don't, right? Try and split it into the greatest frequency you can possibly manage. And I would actually encourage you to do really daily administration, the tiniest amount that you could administer every single day, not once a week, right? Even twice a week is better than once a week, but if you're determined, if we can't sway you from testosterone, then maybe you should basically be looking at every single day administration. This is one of the benefits of the traditional drugs like Anavar that's used. You're giving yourself a little bit every day. That's actually playing into our favor rather than taking more every third day, as it were, because you're getting exposure to the elevated peak levels that you see every third day under that administration model. Okay. So the second thing that you should be aware of is that testosterone is actually supplied in a range of concentrations. And typically for men, we want to get something in the 200 to 250 milligrams per mil or milligrams per cc range. That basically is a nice balance between, the amount of drugs that we have to administer, the volume of drugs we have to administer, and the dose. Now, for women, you want to go the other way, all right? There are products on the market that are as low as 50 milligrams per mil, okay? So the reason that you would do this, all right, and you don't want to go the other way towards high concentrations, you want to go down. The reason that you would do this is because when you're trying to measure out very small micro doses of this drug, one of the things that you should be basically considering is using an insulin syringe, okay? So if in this scenario, this is basically 1 cc being held by this syringe, okay? And I was able to source testosterone at 50 milligrams per cc, okay? And I filled this syringe up, that would be 50 milligrams. So in order for me to get half of that, 25, you could see I could have half the syringe. But if I was using a higher concentration value, that would be harder and harder and harder, incrementally harder to be accurate with how much I'm administering. You also want to use syringes that have no dead space. So whenever you use a normal syringe and you do intramuscular injection, hopefully you'll be familiar with the concept that there's always some hormone left in the dead space of the syringe, which makes measuring out things more complicated as well. So the overall takeaway from this part of this video would be, look, when you're dealing with very small doses of a drug in order to maintain safety and efficacy, measuring them out is harder, okay? When you're dealing with, you're in a cc of something, it's relatively easy to draw it up in a 3 cc syringe, and you're not going to be, right on the button, but you're going to be pretty close, okay? And as the dosages come down, you basically need to be mindful of the fact that that's going to be harder and harder and harder, and these are two tools that you can use to assist you with this. So you can basically use an insulin syringe with no dead space. It helps dramatically with the accuracy. You can get lower concentration testosterone, so whatever the lowest is you can find, 50 milligrams per mil. That's the lowest that I'm aware that is commonly manufactured, and that would be better obviously than 300 milligrams per mil, hopefully for obvious reasons. 3 is you don't want to administer once a week, you want to administer once every basically day ideally. And I just want to show you one last slide, because this is really designed to be a primer, a high-level discussion about, testosterone isn't off the table, right? Testosterone is potentially problematic because of the dosages used. And when you actually sit down and look at things like 20 milligrams of Anavar a day, right, is not necessarily going to be any less androgenic than 7 milligrams or 10 milligrams of testosterone a week. It's not. It has 1/5 of the androgenic impact, but you're taking a hell of a lot more of it. So its androgenic impact potentially is greater than testosterone at a high enough dose. Hopefully that makes sense, right? So the problem with testosterone in women is the measurement and administration of that compound at very small doses, and then the monitoring of that to ensure that we basically are not stepping over the line. Now, one of the benefits, one of the advantages that testosterone has over all these other drugs is fundamentally this, and that is you can go into a pathology lab and get your blood drawn and confirm what the consequence of that drug administration is against your blood profile. You cannot do that with any other drug. You cannot go into the lab and say, how am I doing against this Anavar that I'm taking? Those tests are not available on a practical level, right? But they are with testosterone. And I want to show you this blood work from a client because it's really, really interesting. This was basically blood work taken 4 days after the last administration of 20 milligrams a week. And you can see the level of testosterone there is significantly more than the client expected, okay? This is actually the advantage of testosterone for women, and that is that you can administer what you think is right, and you can go and test it, Okay, and you can say, okay, so I understand I want to be a little bit outside of your normal range. I understand that there's good evidence to support being outside of normal range, and I can see the consequence of that action through the studies that we have on the escalation of testosterone in women. There are a number of them. I accept that risk profile. As I said, this is the one quirk about testosterone that potentially is not I never see this discussed, but is potentially advantageous against all of the other drugs, all of them that we have basically as anabolic androgenic steroids, and that is you can actually administer the drug at the protocol that you choose, at the risk profile that you have selected for yourself, and then you can go away and you can test it and say, right, you're in. That's what I'm looking for. I wanted to set myself up to be there. I created this profile to ideally create that outcome, and I can go away and I can pay some money to confirm that that's where I'm at. And in this particular case, we sent the lady off for testing, and we realized based on how much she was taking that she was getting far greater a return than she was expecting. So what can we do? We can lower the dose, all right? And we can modulate the protocol in order to basically say, okay, so we don't need that much. Let's just come down. Okay? Now, you can't do that with anything else. You have no idea. You literally have no idea what those drugs are basically producing in terms of serum levels of those drugs as an individual. And so, as I said, this is an interesting drug because it is controversial. It is not to be fucked around with. I completely agree with it, but none of these drugs are to be fucked around with. But it does have one small advantage, and that is that if you are very diligent and you are very careful with this drug, you can actually go and regularly look at yourself and say, right, how am I doing? Okay? Don't delude yourself. Do not delude yourself that Anavar is safe, right? Or Winstrol is safe. No. The basis of that is that there is a reduced androgenic component to these drugs, and provided you take a small enough amount of it that you fall underneath the threshold of what testosterone would do, there's advantage, therapeutic advantage, no question. The challenge is that number is really small, very small, smaller than most women use, okay? So the takeaway from this whole video would be, don't delude yourself that these women-friendly drugs are women-friendly at any dose. They are not. Their advantage over testosterone is premised on clinical dosage being, or having rather, a total androgenic load lesser than an equivalent dose of testosterone required to realize your goals. So that's it for today's video. Controversial. Hopefully that's a little bit eye-opening. A lot of people don't understand this about testosterone. And I look forward to seeing you at the next Victor Black Masterclass. Sawadee ka.